in the low desert in beautiful Tempe, Arizona, and Jack Henriks's mother's margarita porch in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. This is Politics in the Past with Robert Ferguson. Here joined with by South Dakota Jack for the first time in a few weeks and maybe well over a month. Jack, welcome back.
It was hard to be gone, but it's good to be back.
Jack is in what we're calling the South Dakota interregnum between two very significant trips to Europe, where he was in Prague for 5 weeks, I think, 4 weeks,
Yeah,
and that now you're about to embark on a semester abroad in Florence. And so we are just so grateful that we could capture you in this brief South Dakota interregnum. Now, here's the problem with Jack's mom's margarita porch. There seems to be a slight delay. Um, but anyway, so Jack, one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you specifically today is your trip to Prague. You were there for 4 weeks, and you were there at Charles University, correct?
correct, correct.
And what were you studying at Charles University for that 4 weeks?
Yeah, I was studying political economics, being sort of the umbrella term, but we had three different classes. One was a more traditional political economics class that was focused on, specifically economic theory. And then we had a political philosophy class, delving into some of the why and the how of that economic theory, providing it some context. And then we specifically had a conflict management course that was fascinating, looking into the role of economics and politics in averting and concluding conflicts, both between states and interstate conflicts, or pardon me,
Inter
intrastate.
yeah. Very interesting. So what that sounds to me like is sort of a classical liberal uh intellectual course for a few weeks. Is that incorrect?
Oh, absolutely. It was absolutely a classical liberal education. Studying the program, it's called TFAS, which stands for the Fund of American Studies, in Prague, was established in 1997. This was its 33rd year. Um, maybe it was established in 1997. I'm doing that math wrong. But in any event, it was established specifically after the fall of the Berlin Wall to expose students in recently post-Soviet countries to liberal economics and to neoliberal economics. Students who hadn't ever received an education in the role of markets, or in innovation, the capacity of exchange, the invisible hand. Students who had never read Adam Smith, or had been never been exposed to Hayek. And the goal was to show students there is an alternative intellectual framework for
Mhm.
political economics. There is a way that this can work besides the Soviet model. There is a way that it works in a great deal of the world. And so, continuing in that tradition, the program seeks to bring students from all over together to give them that classical liberal education.
Well, given that it was intended to introduce students who've really never encountered this framework before, I actually can't think of a better place to draw students from than US academia, where
Absolutely not. Yeah.
where this framework seems to have disappeared too, as far as people being introduced to it. Um, so Jack, I'd like you, if you wouldn't mind, because you've read this stuff so recently. Um, well, actually, let me start here. What were your expectations going in as far as what you would learn and whether you would what you would appreciate about it?
Yeah, going into it, I expected to learn that liberal economic framework, which I had been exposed to in some of my classes. I'd like to highlight Dr. Henry Thompson, who taught me my initial political economic theory class and did an excellent job. But I did not expect the philosophical grounding. where when we talk about political economics in an economics degree, at least at Arizona State University, it's a conversation about political economics. And when you talk about liberal economic theory, it's a conversation about deregulation, about markets. Whereas we go to Prague, and certainly like the first week was laying economic foundations for students who haven't had it before, who weren't fortunate enough to take political economic theory with Dr. Thompson. But then the second week, we got into those grand philosophical questions about individualism, about Aristotle, about the Scottish Enlightenment. And so getting into these deeper questions of who am I, who are you, what do we owe to one another, what brings us together, in using that as a paradigm through which we can evaluate political economy, that I hadn't expected. And that was something that I personally enjoyed. I found to be a really rigorous and insightful intellectual experience, made me question many of the things that I had thought previously.
Yeah, I think there's a misunderstanding from most people about maybe liberal thought. And again, when we're using the word liberal here, we don't mean left liberal like in the United States. It's typically attributed to, the tradition begun by, or attributed to Franklin Roosevelt, maybe progressives in American history. But I mean small L liberal in the sense of individual rights, markets, and freedoms, that's sort and that the individual is at the center of analysis. And so this is anyway, I mean, in the United States, for the most part, virtually everybody has always been a liberal. This is Louis Hartz's book, Liberal Tradition in America, that basically, because the United States was born without an aristocracy, that individualism has always been the key, has always been one of its key characteristics, and therefore, non-liberal traditions have always struggled to take hold in any particular way. So when we say liberal, Ronald Reagan's a liberal, Bill Clinton's a liberal, Franklin Roosevelt's a liberal, Abraham Lincoln's a liberal. This tradition. Um, and I do think there's a misunderstanding about this small L liberal tradition in that it it's like you sometimes hear it pejoratively described as like, oh, it's just like a rational actor model of society, or it's about rational unit satisfaction, and that's the whole purpose of it. But it's not. There's an entire moral philosophy associated with it too. Like economics is at the center of it, but there's also a political and moral philosophy too. Now did you read Smith for this course?
Yes, we read Smith. There was an emphasis in the program, in addition to it being the 250th anniversary of the USA this year. It's also the 250th anniversary of the publication of The Wealth of Nations. And so there was a consistent theme of Smith, specifically on The Wealth of Nations, um, discussing his ideas, and how they have been interpreted and implied over the years, which was really fascinating from an intellectual history point of view. One of the things that I really enjoy doing, and this is another thing, Dr. Thompson. It's going to sound like he's been paying me to stump for him. I promise. This is out of my own free will. This is another thing that I especially appreciated about his class, where I think many professors are scared to assign the great books or the great thinkers to their students because they think that their students are too lazy, or aren't well educated enough and they won't get it. And so they'll assign analyses of those great books. This is something that both Dr. Thompson did and the professors, Dr. Adam Martin, Dr. Nikolai Wenzel, in TFAS did, is they said, you're smart, you're university students, you're, getting to the end of your degree. Um, read Smith, read Hayek, read the ideas for yourself, think about them for yourself. And so, specifically Smith, because of that anniversary component, but all throughout the program, there was an emphasis on, we're not telling you how you should feel about Adam Smith. we're saying you are smart enough to read Adam Smith. Here's a group of people where you can talk about it.
So how did your perspective on maybe Smith or even Hayek change?
Yeah, and I'll start with Hayek. You know, listeners, longtime listeners of the podcast will know that I am perhaps my politics is not predisposed to agree with Hayek. I am more of a Keynesian by nature. However, after reading The Power Broker a year and a half ago, I read The Power Broker and then I read The Road to Serfdom. And I thought, Hayek is writing in many ways, in my interpretation of it, about a Robert Moses-esque figure, a man who is able to become this bureaucrat of nebulous origin and of whose authority is provided by nebulous means, but who has managed to entrench himself and wield so much power because of the laziness and stupidity of elected officials. And so that was my primary, thoughts about Hayek going into this program. I had never conceived, or I had not conceived of Hayek as being sort of a fully fleshed political economist or political economy philosopher. I was familiar with his work specifically as it related to bureaucracy. And so expanding my conception of Hayek to encompass that more thorough political economy standpoint was fascinating. And then with Adam Smith, we discussed specifically Adam Smith's thoughts on imperialism, which had been an element of Smith, an element of the Wealth of Nations with which I was previously unfamiliar. Um, and I think it's important because there is within leftist circles, there is a tendency to call capitalism, a colonialist or a neo-colonialist or an imperialist structure, perpetuating those dynamics. And that was a tendency of the Soviet Union and so on. And I'm not going to stand here and say that every capitalist has behaved in a good fashion towards developing countries. But having read this, it has completely changed my understanding of capitalism as it relates to colonialism, because Smith writes in The Wealth of Nations that colonies, he's specifically discussing Great Britain's policy colonies, are a horrible economic endeavor because of the mass expenditures, beyond a moral dimension, the mass expenditures they require in terms of shipping and the military, and the relatively limited amount of revenue that one can draw. And so it provides a new dimension. And, over the last month on the podcast, this political podcast, every political podcast, we've been talking at length about the DSA and the talking points of the left wing of the Democratic Party. And I think it's important, after you listen to talking points all day, to go home and read the great thinkers, and think about the issues not from the perspective of cable news, but rather from the intellectual history and context.
Oh man, I couldn't agree more. Good elitist that I am. I can't agree more. But you mentioned Smith. Uh, Smith's an anti-imperialist. He's not a he. He's this is sometimes a thing that I think liberal thinkers fall into is by temperament, liberals are not radicals. With few, there are exceptions. There are radical liberals, but for the most people like Thomas Paine, for instance, but most liberal intellectuals are not necessarily radicals, and so they're trying to create a non-violent solution that is going to improve the world, right? Maybe not radically reshape the world because the liberalism tends to be a little nervous about major um there's a conservative streak in them for the most part, not always, but there's a bit of a conservative streak in them, which is they're afraid of totally upsetting the apple cart and beginning like from ground zero, right? Or year zero, as the case may be. um but in Smith, and we see that kind of that tension in Smith, right? where he is an anti-imperialist, but he's not calling for massive colonial uprisings against the British Empire, right? What he's talking about is, okay, what can the UK do? What can the British Empire do in order to not only improve life for British citizens, but also to create a better empire, right? Which is actually way less coercive. An empire that's considerably less coercive. And if you follow Smith's thinking, it ceases to actually become an empire, right? At least in the formulation. Um, and what's really interesting about the Scottish Enlightenment, and Smith in particular, is that it is a carryover from the Irish Enlightenment of about 80 years previously. And Francis Hutchinson is a key figure here. He's a Scots Irishman, and what you could call the Irish, I'm calling it the Irish Enlightenment. I might be the first person to call it that, but in the 17 teens, there's this flourishing of thought, kind of at the end of Queen Anne's reign in Ireland, typically centered around Dublin and then London and then Derry, where you have these thinkers that are trying to say, okay, these are they're typically the dissenter, sorry, like the nonconformist tradition in Ireland. So they're not Catholics and they're not Anglo-Irish. They're the Scots Irish, right? And what they want to do is they want to economically develop Ireland. And they're looking around and they're going, this whole estate system, the feudal system or the plantation system that they've imposed on Ireland is not only horrifically violent and terrible, but it's also not doing it's not even doing what the Londoners want. Like it's not doing what they want, and it assumes the worst of Catholics, and the Anglo-Irish say a lot that they're not there. The propaganda isn't real about them. And we see this, and there's I might be overstating this, but there's some relationship between like Wolfe Tone and the Anglo-Irish, sorry, and the Scots-Irish, right? There is this notion among the Irish nationalists and the Scots-Irish of like, hey, we're kind of working together here, right? And this comes to a head in 1721. I'd have to check the date on that. 1721, where there's a desire to create an Irish bank that's financed. The idea is what we need is we need London to finance it because economic development in Ireland, this place is way too poor. And it's maintained poor by the plantation system, but it's just an incredibly poor place, and we need economic development. And so there's this flourishing of like really impressive economic thought, and David Hume's associated with it too, right? They're reading Hume. But Francis Hutchinson's this really key figure where there's what that this debate is being worked out over what this bank is going to look like. Now the bank gets killed, gets nixed by London, but and around that are all these really interesting ideas. People are like, if we get this bank set up, we can set up a society that looks like this. We can set up a society that looks like that. Also, we can't have tariffs. Also, we can't have quotas. We can't have these, what become, the corn laws. We can't have these things because how is Ireland ever going to economically develop if all we do is sell wool? And even then, we can't even we can't even, and we can only sell it to London. We can't even sell it where there's a better market for it in Holland. And so there's this whole flourishing of thinking. And Francis Hutchinson is the figure that actually carries over because he starts teaching at the University of Glasgow. And who's one of Hutchinson's students? Adam Smith. And so the anti-imperial streak comes from Ireland and comes right through. So I mean, I think it's a really important part of this thought that you're right. I mean, I think people have ignored it and forgotten about it. Maybe because it's not presented in a radical way.
I mean, that's an incredibly important thing to remember. And to bring it back to economics, um, I'm reading Rick Atkinson's the first volume of the 3-volume Revolutionary War history that he's putting out right now. And in it, he's got a first chapter sort of laying out the causes of the Revolutionary War, which I've been familiar with growing up in American schools. But one of the things he really emphasized that I appreciate that I don't think is emphasized enough was the interest of Americans who wanted to ship their goods to non-British ports. You had regulations, so many regulations. Britain, as a colonial power, were saying, well, A, you can't manufacture in the colonies because we need you to buy our manufactured goods. And B, we don't want you trading your tobacco with Holland or with Spain or whomever, because that would then raise the price of your tobacco. And we would like to purchase your free tobacco. And the Americans are sitting there thinking, well, we can't develop economically because we can't grow a manufacturing base and we have all of these trade restrictions. And so you have what is essentially like what would today be called a neoliberal trade policy, of a free trade, free development policy, that is, or politics that is driving so much of the American Revolution, and emanates in many ways from the Scottish Enlightenment. And I know that you've read Arthur Herman, but talking about then how the Scottish Enlightenment via John Witherspoon at Princeton becomes foundational to American political philosophy and political economy. And so when you talk about, that sort of anti-imperialist and also, very, very, very early liberal, or what would today be a neoliberal economic approach, that is foundational to the American political philosophy.
It's also anti-imperial, despite what the radical left says.
Yeah. hmm
And
And in that, but you're absolutely right to say that that's the problem, because nobody talking to the Reverend John Witherspoon would think, oh, that guy's a radical, or Francis Hutcheson would say, oh, that guy's a radical. I mean,
maybe
when you watch
Hutchinson at
17,
times, maybe, but generally not.
yeah,
He had an acid tip
yeah.
pen, but yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah,
But you watch the 1776 musical, and John Witherspoon's in that, and his stodginess is played for laughs.
yeah.
And so yeah, it's things like that you don't think about how radical a person is if they don't present as being radical.
Right. And the ideas that are at the heart of a liberal tradition are radical because fundamentally,
Oh,
and now I'm on a soapbox, Jack. You got me on the soapbox. I'm sorry. Well, I got myself on it maybe. But
well, you sent me a text saying, "Hey, do you want to talk about classical liberal thought and education?" And I thought, I'm going to talk for 3 minutes, and Rob's gonna discuss, offer his thoughts.
yeah.
So please do fulfill my
Oh yeah,
expectation.
you're welcome. You're welcome. Yeah, okay. So the notion comes down to the fundamental thing that changes with classical liberalism is the notion that sovereignty truly does lie within the people. And then the next question that you need to ask is if sovereignty lies in the people, do you trust the people to possess that sovereignty? And if you trust the people to possess that sovereignty, then you are going to give them the liberty with which to do that. That manifests itself in the marketplace by saying, you know what? If individuals are operating as their own producers and their own consumers, generally free of coercion, we actually kind of trust them. We don't think they're going to be perfect, but we actually kind of trust them to create a marketplace that generally provides our wants and our needs. Um, and so that's what market economics is fundamentally about, that we actually trust people to function as independent producers and consumers. Doesn't mean there's no role for government. It doesn't mean that there's no role for things here and there. But what we're saying, what the argument is that unlike people who don't trust people, unlike those who do not trust society to be to be economic agents, they feel like somebody needs to tell them how to operate. And that's what you see on the left and on the radical right is this notion of we don't trust the people. The liberal trusts the people. And in economics, that manifests itself in market economics. In politics that represent that manifests itself as a type of liberalism, sometimes representative liberalism, sometimes other forms of liberalism, but generally it means that, some form of, we need a democracy, we need people to hold people, we're going to let the people hold the elected officials accountable, because even if we don't always like the people, even if they don't get things right away, generally we believe over the long term we trust the people. And I think that's the heart of liberalism's moral philosophy, is that in the end we actually kind of trust people.
That's such an important point to affirm that liberalism, that the heart of liberalism is in a trust for people. I remember in Dominion. Did you ever get around to reading Dominion?
Yeah, yeah. It's a really good
The
book.
Yeah. Oh, it's a really good book. So for
The
context,
Tom Holland book.
Dr. Donald Critchlow, who is the head of the Center for American Institutions, read a book called Dominion by Tom Holland about a year ago, and he thought it was fantastic. So fantastic that he bought a dozen copies off of Amazon and handed it to basically everybody he saw that day. And so I ended up with a copy, and Rob ended up with a copy. A whole bunch of people ended up with a copy. And I read it, and it was fascinating to read about how that liberal core, that at the end of the day we trust the people, in order for that to be true, you first have to say at the end of the day, people are people, that all people have a certain dignity to them, that they're fundamentally equal, and that notion in the Western intellectual tradition comes from the biblical notion that all men or all people are created in God's image.
Mhm.
And so you can draw, according to Tom Holland at least, a straight line from neoliberals to liberals, to the concept of human dignity straight to the Bible, because or pardon me, before the notion that we are all created in God's image, you had absolutely um, societies in which, Holland writes about this at length and in pretty graphic detail, in which humans who were not considered human had, horrific acts perpetrated unto them because they simply weren't seen as human. Their pain wasn't seen as being worth anything. It wasn't until you had the notion that we are all created in God's image that you can trust individuals to make their own political and economic decisions. And so it's interesting, and we're sort of free associating here over the air. But when you read, again, going back to when you trust your students to read the great books of theory, of political economy theory and political philosophy and of history, they can pick out these through lines between the different books and the different thinkers and the different traditions and the different eras. The key is, just as the liberals have to trust the individuals in the market, the teacher has to trust their students in the classroom. And that, to bring it all back home, I've been reading about Bob Dylan recently. So to bring it all back home, that was my absolute favorite part of TFAS and this educational program in Prague. They trusted the students, provided them, here are some reading materials you might find interesting. Here are some ideas to grapple with. We trust you to make these connections and to have these thoughts. And that, in that liberal intellectual tradition is something I really appreciate.
Yeah. Um, well, I'm so glad you enjoyed it, and it's and I mean I also want to get your take on Prague here. I'm gonna I've talked too much. I'm gonna get your take on. I mean, because
Prague's a beautiful city.
what a setting to study this in, right?
Oh, my Lord. If you have not, dear listener, been to Prague, book a plane ticket, pause this podcast, book a plane ticket, then come back to this podcast. It is such a beautiful city. It is a sublime place to study. Prague, has gorgeous, gorgeous, gorgeous architecture because it was, ahead of, it was a capital in early Europe of Bohemia. and then Charles the fourth was a Holy Roman Emperor, and so there is royal regal architecture in the city that then was not bombed to oblivion during World War II. And so it is extant. There is a reason that whenever you watch a movie that takes place in any point in Europe pre-World War II, there's a good chance that movie was filmed in Prague, because Prague is one of the last cities that looks like that. And so when you go to Prague, you have to uh, remember that it is a post-Soviet country. It's doing well. The Czech Republic is certainly a wealthy nation doing well, but there are things like on the tram lines, they're still running Soviet era trams. And so you can get onto a Soviet era tram to ride across the a beautiful bridge overlooking a beautiful river um, uh, uh, with beautiful buildings on both sides. And it's other things like they haven't switched to LED lights. And so the lights are yellow. They're that beautiful pale yellow and not the harsh white. And so if you go on one of the Soviet trams over the beautiful river with the beautiful architecture at night, it's all bathed in this beautiful pale yellow light. And so it was a fantastic place to study. I imagine it would be a fantastic place to just spend a vacation. There are some pretty decent clubs there too, if you're interested in that sort of thing. So on behalf of Prague, the Prague Chamber of Commerce and Tourism Bureau, you should absolutely visit.
Yeah, it's a cool place. And I think, and one of the things that you brought up that I think is so neat, and again, just uh, that there's this like integration of like medieval Europe, Soviet Europe, and modern Europe, and early modern Europe, of course, and like fin de siècle, like all of that is kind of in one place, and you'd be hard pressed to find another part of Europe that, because so many of the major cities were bombed during the Second World War, other than Prague, very few of them have the. You go to Berlin, for instance, and the medieval center of Berlin is like one little block, really. I mean, I'm underselling it. It's a little bigger than that. And you've got the fin de siècle, like kind of the early modern fin de siècle stuff, like with the Brandenburg Gate, and a few other things. But for the most part, because of, you know, the Battle of Berlin, there's not a whole lot left in it, right? Krakow's another place where you'd see a little bit more like Prague, but because again, it wasn't. Although there was, you can see the Second World War there and its effects. The German army actually retreated from Krakow before the Soviets counterattacked there. So that kind of prevented it from being the center of an epic battle like Berlin was. So, but it's yeah, it's that weird combination of like medieval Europe, early modern, fin de siècle, Soviet Europe and modern Europe in one place.
But I think that it's so essential to study there, not just because it's beautiful, it is beautiful, but it is a beautiful place that was once a very not beautiful place.
Yeah,
Because in Prague, you have extended occupations by the Nazis, by Nazi totalitarianism, and by Soviet, what Václav Havel would call post-totalitarianism. And so it is important, I think, to study there, not just because it is a nice and pretty city, but because it's a reminder that horrific acts of authoritarian violence, that state suppression, that the opposite of liberalism can uh, are not permanent.
they're not
That
permanent, but
the effort,
they can also come to the most liberal of places.
yes, but that when you are studying in college, there's the old Ivy League academic or ivory tower academic stereotype of studying in these beautiful places, totally sheltered from problems, or totally sheltered from the real struggles that real people have. And the city of Prague offers a great antidote, I think, to that, because it is a reminder that things can be bad, and there are remnants of that, but that people can overcome them.
Mm.
And in this period of turbulent politics, I think that those reminders of hope are important.
Yeah, yeah, and hopefully a reminder of the values of of liberalism, because the place is a heck of a lot better now that it's returned to its, I think it's more liberal bearing.
Hmm. Yeah.
Okay, but so I do want to. I mean, I wanted a little bit of a jump to Prague there to stop to stop my own um, mouth running ahead of myself, if for no other reason. Jack, so you read Hayek, you read Smith. Um, how would you how did you think the other students came into it? Like, was it a bunch of people who are already converts to classical liberalism that were there, or was it a broader group?
I think it was a broader group. It was a very good mix. We had a lot of people who came from, other post-Soviet countries, Kosovo, Georgia, Ukraine, who had, very recent experiences
Mhm,
of state-planned economies and of authoritarianism, and so were therefore predisposed to liberal thought. You also had a lot of Americans, and I fall not, I think, within, but pretty close to this camp, who had, whose familiarity with the Soviet Union, with authoritarianism, is through books and movies, and who have sort of been swept along in this anti-liberal ideological current that's pretty prevalent in many circles, particularly on the left, who were not predisposed to like Smith or Hayek. And I think that really the way that I was able to avoid that sort of ideological channel is by working at the Center for American Institutions and being exposed to these ideas. But I think that TFAS, by in a very similar way to the Center for American Institutions, was able to appeal to those folks because they didn't say, okay, here's why neoliberalism is the greatest thing that's ever existed, and here's why you must be a neoliberal. They said, here are the intellectual foundations of neoliberalism. Here's the philosophy underpinning the ideas. Here are the moral values that it upholds, the value of human dignity and in individual choice, individual capacity. Um, think for yourself. Let's talk about it. Dr. Nikolai
yeah,
Wenzel, who was one of our professors, a brilliant, brilliant, brilliant man. He definitely, at the end, like the man has political opinions, of course, but he would walk into class and he would say, okay, I've assigned you Rawls and Wilmore Kendall. Let's talk about it. And so we just talked about it for 45 minutes. And so it was that incredibly open attitude towards education, towards discourse, and fundamentally that trust of their students that really brought even those students who came thinking, I'm going to hate this, I'm going to hate, I hate neoliberalism, brought them into the fold. And so even if they don't agree with it necessarily, they can recognize its intellectual or its philosophical merit.
yeah. Interesting. I mean, I think this is something that we've seen in American academia. It's not just in America; it's around the world. But maybe it's the problem is centered where it is. We don't want to try. We're going to introduce this reading, or we want to assign this person, but we're afraid of we're going to traumatize or we're going to offend our students, and we infantilize them. We don't treat them as adults. You have to trust them. This is again the thing. If you infantilize people, it's a step towards if you infantilize students who are 18 years old, university students who are 18 years old and older, it's a step towards it's a step towards authoritarianism or at least illiberalism, if not totalitarianism, because by infantilizing them, you're condescending to them and you're showing you don't trust them. I'm not saying I would trust an 18-year-old with my car on any day, and that's different from saying I'm going to trust them with the ideas. They're voters. They have the right to vote. I'm going to trust them with ideas. They are adults. I would say that I wouldn't trust every 18-year-old with my car, I guess, might be my way of putting it. There might be some I trust
Yeah.
with it, but not many. Um, there's but you gotta be if you can't trust an 18-year-old with an idea, when can you trust them with an idea? When can you trust them with challenging material? And if you never challenge them, if you
To
never trust
belabor
them
that
with it.
metaphor,
Go ahead.
yeah. To belabor that metaphor, I think that the most important thing is to trust an 18-year-old with that idea or with your car at the age of 18 because they might run it into a tree. And the most important thing that a young person, an 18-year-old or a 21-year-old or any young person can do is lose an argument, is realize that they, incorrectly, conceived of this idea and to reevaluate their philosophical underpinnings and their intellectual process and to then re-engage with that idea. And so if you never allow your students to crash their intellectual car into a tree, they will never ever ever learn how to not crash their intellectual car into a tree. And that is something that TFAS it does an excellent job of. It's something the Center for American Institutions does an excellent job of. I can't tell you the number of times that Rob or Dr. Ferguson or pardon me, Dr. Webster or Dr. Critchlow or Dr. Barth has presented me with a great idea or a deep question and then talked to me about it and picked my thoughts apart, but in doing so made me a smarter person. And
Y
so I think that, now I'm on my soapbox, but it's so essential to trust young people with these great ideas. Otherwise, they will never know how to drive their car on the road.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, university is supposed to be the time to play with ideas. That's what an education is about, at least in the humanities. And if you never get exposed to them in their proper form, in their unadulterated form, it's just a waste. But anyway, Jack, thank you for making my purpose was not to do a marketing pitch here, but you've basically done it. But we managed to make that happen. Is there any other thinker that you encountered or read? Yeah, is there any other thinker that we talked about Hayek and Smith, but is there any other thinker or book that you encountered that you would recommend people pick up who might be interested in the classical liberal tradition?
I'd be interested in the classical liberal tradition. Just sort of generally, Arthur Herman's How the Scots Invented the Modern World, and then also Arthur Herman's The Cave in the Light are two brilliant books. Herman's a great writer. Um, how the Scots Invented the Modern World is talking about the Scottish Enlightenment and how those um, strains of trusting the individual to make political and intellectual and economic decisions for themselves the filtered through the Western intellectual tradition to the United States and are foundational to today. The Cave in the Light is. Have you ever read The Cave in the Light?
I haven't.
You should. It's brilliant. It's Plato, and he writes about Plato and Aristotle and how fundamentally in that Western intellectual tradition we can trace all of the ideas back to Plato and Aristotle, with Plato being that more communal, writing more communally and writing about perfection, and unknowable truths, and Aristotle instead relying on individual observation and experience, in trusting that sort of inductive mode of knowledge. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant book. If you want to read two books about why we as Westerners trust the individual, I can't recommend them more.
Hmm, that's great. Um, I'm gonna make one last recommendation here in that it's always hard to. You know what? I actually here's where I'm gonna go with this. If you've got access to ProQuest, if you're a reader who has a listener who has access to ProQuest, track down Douglas Adair's dissertation. Douglass. So Douglas with two S's, Adair, Adair. I would highly recommend people read that dissertation. It never got turned into a book, which is truly unfortunate. Well, it did get turned, I shouldn't say, it did get turned into a book about 2000, but it was sort of, he'd been long dead by then. And it, the, the dissertation is actually better, which is very rare to say that the dissertation is better than it. But if you can't get a hold of the dissertation, read the book. It's the origins of Jeffersonian democracy. Is the intellectual origins of Jeffersonian democracy. And I would highly recommend people read that book, especially if you're interested in the classical liberal tradition and the American founding. Um, great, great dissertation, a great book. All right, Jack, you're about to head off to Florence here for like 6 weeks. Sorry, for like 4 months, right?
Yeah, I'm
With a
gonna be there
semester.
through Christmas.
Lucky you. So you're going to miss the elections. That's too bad. We're going to have you on for the
I am gonna
elections.
miss. I sort of feel like um everybody I know is tying themselves to the train on the trolley problem. And I'm frantically running in the other direction. It's a
Well,
wonderful,
you're
wonderful,
frantically
wonderful
running. You're
liberatory.
frantically wrecking. You're frantically running towards that paragon of political stability, Italy.
Yeah, well, they've been doing better as of late. And by as of late, I mean for the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, yeah. The last few years. Anyway, but we aren't going to get into. Unfortunately, we're doing this podcast on a Tuesday. On a Tuesday, today's the big primary in Wisconsin because everybody got tied up about Abdul El Sayed in Michigan last week. Everybody's getting worked up about Francesca Wong in Wisconsin today. I don't know what everybody's going to get worked up over, but the cable news has to get us worked up over something. Um, but what all I'm going to ask Jack is that you've got 13 minutes here before we're at the hour. I'm going to let you talk for as long as you want. What's your sense of where we are? What have the primaries told us anything, and where do you think we are like 90 days from an election?
I'll offer my broader predictions here in a moment, but I want to say a word now about this the equivalency that dumber people in the media are drawing between Abdul El Sayed and Francesca Hong, and how that's really not a great equivalency. For starters, Abdul El Sayed is not in the DSA. Francesca Hong is. And I think that that speaks to their one's relative merits as a campaigner and as a candidate, and the other's failings. Abdul El Sayed, he's to the left of many people. He's to the left of Rob. He's to the left of me. He's to the left of many of the people who listen to this podcast. But the guy fundamentally has some intellectual groundings to his thoughts. He's a Rhodes Scholar. The man has, brought he is, to the left, but he is not to the left in an anti-intellectual way. He is not to the left in a way that makes me embarrassed to be a Democrat. Francesca Hong is a member of the DSA, and right now I'm a little bit down on the DSA because I saw the absolutely ridiculous things that the vice chair of the DSA said about Ukraine. That I texted to you, Rob, saying that we need to stop sending all aid to Ukraine, that we should instead just send diplomats, all of the diplomats, to figure it out. Um, is a member of the DSA, and her big platform, from what I gather, is ending holidays. She doesn't seem to like any of the holidays. She's anti Valentine's Day. She's anti Thanksgiving. She's anti the 4th of July. And so my I think that the media has done everybody, all of us as consumers, a disservice by equating these two candidates. Where you can disagree with Abdul El Sayed, but I think it's important to recognize that the man has a brain on his shoulders and may have reached different conclusions to you, but has reached conclusions. But Francesca Hong, and this is not just me saying this, by the way, this is a direct quote or this is something that Tony Evers, the incumbent Democratic governor of Wisconsin, said just a few weeks ago, that Francesca Hong his policy positions comes from whatever she saw on the Twitter. He did say the Twitter and not Twitter, which is delightful. But this is coming from the Democratic governor of Wisconsin about the front runner for the Democratic primary nomination for Wisconsin. That Francesca Hong is sort of just waving in the wind and saying whatever the wokest thing she can say to keep in mind with the woke on Twitter. And this has been my rant that I needed to get off my chest. Stop equating Abdul Syed to Francesca Hong. It does everybody a disservice to those of us who are trying to think about politics. That being said, I think that 90 days out, assuming, and the polling indicates that Hong will win the nomination for Wisconsin governor, I think that these differences in the candidacies will be borne out. Or I think that El Sayed will probably end up winning in Michigan, maybe not by a lot, but will probably end up winning in Michigan. And I think if Hong is nominated, that Tom Tiffany, the Republican nominee, will win that governor's race. Because is such a stark difference in the sincerity and heft in those different candidates' ideas.
Yeah, I mean, I think,
Your thoughts, Rob?
well, yeah, no, my thoughts. Thank you. I was going to offer them. Don't worry. You've been this long enough. I don't need your invitation. Um, the Generally agree with everything you just said there. There's a difference. There's a significant difference, substantive difference between the two. One is an adult and one is not, frankly. It can almost be that simple. And uh, again, Al Sayed he's got some foreign policy opinions I disagree with. Pretty substantial foreign policy I disagree with, and other things that I significantly disagree with. The reason that people are calling him DSA Jack, frankly, is because he hits the two criteria that is really all the DSA needs in order to support you. One is you call Israel's treatment of Gaza genocide, and two, you believe in Medicare for all. Al Sayed believes in those two things, he's admitted as much, and therefore he gets DSA support. That's why he's considered part of the DSA. I think there's a narrow DSA and a broad DSA, and Al Sayed's in the broad DSA, even if he's not in the narrow DSA. Um, but um, both Al Sayed and Wong are going to face formidable Republican opponents in the fall. These are not weak opponents. Mike Rogers and Tiffany are not weak opponents. They're pretty good Republican opponents. Here's my biggest problem with Wong. When she was running for Senate, whatever. I don't want her to win. I think she'd lose, probably lose. But ultimately, when you're a senator, you've got a significant amount of responsibility. But ultimately, you're just one vote in 100. And you're not tasked with running a government.
That's the thing. Thank you. I was going to say that after you were done.
Yeah. Francesca Wong is campaigning to run a government. Whatever you may think of Abdul El Sayed's beliefs, and I don't think much of them, if he was elected governor of Michigan, he could at least do, I think, some form of professional job of the thing.
Yeah.
Do you trust Francesca Wong with running a state government? And would you trust her with running a lemonade stand?
Yeah. Well, and that's like, and we've talked about the importance of competence, just sheer competence, in running in being governor before. I've talked about it in terms of Kristi Noem and the lack thereof several times on this podcast. But the I appreciate you bringing that up, where this is a tendency, I think, of many on the left. And I'm going to talk about the narrow DSA instead of the broad DSA for a moment, to really not understand that different jobs in government have different roles. And I remember, 2, 3 years ago when you had like the Denver, or pardon me, like the San Francisco City Council and School Board, putting out or putting out statements, or voting on resolutions, that we needed or supporting Palestine. And I'm sitting there thinking, what do the people of Palestine care what the San Francisco school board has to say, or the people of or Benjamin Netanyahu for that matter? Like, your job is not that. You are not a foreign policy. You are not elected to opine about foreign policy. You are elected to choose what textbooks go in the schools of San Francisco, and that is important because it's incredibly important to know what textbooks are going in schools in San Francisco, that the teachers in San Francisco are qualified, that the lunches being served in San Francisco cafeterias are nutritious, that the school bus drivers don't have DUIs. And so you are shirking your incredibly important yet more mundane duty to pontificate and pose by opining on these, flashier, bigger issues. And so that is my concern about a Hong as governor of Wisconsin. That job is incredibly important to make sure that the bureaucracy of a state is functioning, that there is oversight. If you don't think it's important, look at what happened in Minnesota. And so, in absence of somebody who can competently and is satisfied to competently administer a mundane organization, can be catastrophic. And I think that is why I am personally kind of scared to have her be the Democratic nominee.
Yeah, and I mean, I actually think overall this is where, maybe you and I probably might disagree on just the expectations. Is I actually think voters in various states, I think there's governor races that are going to go more Republican than the Senate, and that even though the national environment might be very pro-democratic, I think that there's going to be a few governors races where the Republicans win, despite that over
Well, and
significant that in governors races that Republicans are going to significantly outperform the national trend.
yeah, in governors races have always been more, flexible than the nation.
Right.
That's going to be true of in like Iowa's going to elect a Democratic governor in November, and Vermont's going to elect a Republican governor in November, and that's a good thing. We should be electing governors based on the individual candidate's chops and competency, and commitment to the mundane nature of that
And the
office, not
individual
just on their
individual
partisan
say.
lean. We should be the same for the Senate, but it's different.
Yeah, I mean
And
it's
and so
it is.
that's a good thing.
Mhm. Anyway, on
But
that,
yeah, I
uh,
appreciate you giving me the opportunity to offer my thoughts on that, because I've had thoughts on it. And I like getting them off my chest.
that's what I'm here for. All right. Well, on that note, I will let you enjoy the rest of your South Dakota interregnum. Enjoy the margarita porch, and
Shall.
we will will be uh, we'll certainly have you on again. Hopefully, not too long after you get to Florence, and we we should be back here on a regular recording schedule starting this week. So, anyway,
Absolutely.
all right, Jack. Take care.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.